Students, welcome to a particularly low energy video from Mr. Everton, who is tired and still drinking his coffee. Today we're going to learn about how coffee reached the entire world as part of the Columbian Exchange. We're going to be answering the question, how did the Columbian Exchange change societies on both sides of the Atlantic? So in order to introduce this, I'm going to insult your intelligence a little bit, but that's okay because, whatever, I'm a teacher and you're a student. You can't do anything about it. Ayo. Maybe I will have high energy in this video, unexpectedly, against all odds. I'm going to blow your mind here. On the eastern side of the Atlantic Ocean, we call that the Eastern Hemisphere. And on the western side, we call it the Western Hemisphere. Basically divides the world into two big pieces. We've got Africa, Europe, and Asia in the Eastern Hemisphere, and we've got the Americas, North and South America, in the Eastern Hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere. Wow, I'm insulting your intelligence, and then I'm making word slips like that. How embarrassing for me. So the deal with the Columbian Exchange, if you don't already know, is that for thousands of years before human beings had the technology to cross oceans, these two hemispheres developed in isolation, completely separate from each other, with no contact, or very, very, very small amounts of contact, which means that plants and animals and people developed a certain way in the Western Hemisphere and a certain way in the Eastern Hemisphere, which means there are certain things that were only in the Eastern Hemisphere and only in the Western Hemisphere. And then when people developed the technology to cross oceans, the hemispheres were reunited. So this is a very boring, possibly hard to understand definition of the Columbian Exchange, the biological unification of the Eastern and Western hemispheres in the 1500s. Biological because it has to do with life, right? People, plants, animals, microbes. Unification because for hundreds, thousands of years, they were separated by the ocean. And we just went over Eastern and Western hemispheres. So it's about plants and animals and people crossing the ocean and the kinds of effects that they had when they did that. And the effects were huge. The effects were a really big deal. This is one of the big topics in world history for a reason. So take a look at this map. You can pause it if you want to. Coffee, like I'm drinking here, originally comes from the Eastern Hemisphere. Before the Columbian Exchange, if I was an indigenous American, which, I'm white, I'm super Caucasian, but if I wasn't, if I was, an indigenous American, I would not be drinking coffee. I don't know what I'd be drinking. Pumpkin juice? I'm not sure. Sad days for me. Fortunately, the Columbian Exchange allows me to drink delicious coffee in the morning. Pineapple juice. Of the list of those things, what I would want to be drinking is pineapple juice. But anyway, you can see that there's all kinds of crops that were not available in Europe, Africa, Asia. You can see there are all kinds of animals that were not available in the Americas. Crops too. Wheat, rice, sugar, horses. People in the Americas didn't have any of those things. That's wild. Wild. You should jump up out of your chair right now and say, "Holy crap, I can't believe it." I'm in the room while you're watching this, so if somebody doesn't do that, I'm going to have my feelings hurt. What are some of the effects that it had on the Eastern Hemisphere? Well, for one thing, population increased. Poor people got access to more calories. Potatoes became associated with poor people because they're such an easy food for poor people to grow and eat. Like, whole communities of poor people were able to live off of potatoes. The nutritional value of people's diet went up in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Europe, and in Africa, and in Asia. And that meant that people lived longer. That meant that they had more kids. And that meant that the population went up. Cash crops. People began planting cash crops like cotton, sugar, and tobacco in the Americas, and the money flowed to Europe. More on that in a minute. So that meant that Europeans specifically made a lot more money. And just like huge cultural changes, like people in Italy had never had a tomato before, right? So like pizza, as you now know it, did not exist because people in the Americas didn't have access to pork or cheese or wheat, and people in Europe didn't have access to tomatoes. So like Italian cuisine, Irish cuisine, African food, like Africans didn't have yams yet, I'm pretty sure. Let's go back. Yams? Anyone? Yams? Yeah. Sweet potatoes. Not in Africa yet. Peanuts. Corn. Like chocolate. All right. Huge cultural changes, huge shifts in the way that people think about food. Now, let's talk about the Western Hemisphere, which you just saw a glimpse of the next slide, so it's less happy. Disease meant that in the Western Hemisphere, population went down. I already talked in an earlier video about how this allowed Europeans to conquer much of the Americas. Yeah, huge epidemics of smallpox, measles, typhus, like mumps, chickenpox, all of these diseases that a lot of them come from domesticated farm animals, which they didn't have very many of in the Western Hemisphere before the Columbian Exchange. Europeans had been exposed to them for generations and had developed immunities. And indigenous Americans did not have those immunities at all. So when Europeans came across the ocean, they didn't feel sick. They just had the germs on them and they were immune to it. And, they like coughed like I just did. And the germs got on some Native Americans. They didn't have immunities. They got sick, spread like the plague, literally a plague, killed 90% of the people who lived in the Americas. Hard to get your mind around what that would look like. I mean, imagine like The Walking Dead. Like imagine America like it's The Walking Dead with like empty interstate highways and like cars just like sitting there abandoned. Like that's like the level of destruction that it had on Native American populations during this time period. Here's another thing. Like a lot of times when we imagine Native Americans, we imagine like dude with feathers in his hair riding a horse on the Great Plains. Native Americans didn't have horses. They walked everywhere. That's crazy. They didn't have pigs. When the Spanish armies got here, they brought pigs with them, released the pigs into the forest so that they could go hunt them and eat them later. So now in America, we have populations of wild pigs because pigs came from Spanish people. This is when barbecue was invented. People began smoking pigs in the Caribbean. Like, there was no barbecue. I know I'm fixated on food. Maybe I didn't eat breakfast. Actually, that's what it is. Cash crops. Here we have a man working on a sugar plantation. This is very hard work. It's also incredibly lucrative. You can't eat sugar, like to live off of. You can eat it, obviously, but it's not going to be like the thing that sustains you and like helps you to live like for any length of time. But it tastes good. Rich people in Europe wanted it, and they didn't have the climate to grow it in Europe. So they went to the Americas. They found all this land. They're like, we're just going to take this land from these indigenous people, or they're dead, and we're just going to take it, and we're going to grow lots and lots of sugar. Awesome. And we're going to make lots of money. Oh, but wait, there's a problem. All of these Native Americans are dying. We don't have people to work on the plantations to grow the sugar so that we can make all the money off of it. What are we going to do? And this leads to, plantation agriculture. I have an image for plantation agriculture. Where are they going to get the labor to work on the plantations? You probably already know. We're going to have a whole video on the Atlantic slave trade. This is another part of the Columbian Exchange. It's going to be the next video, the last video in the packet. It'll definitely be a huge bummer. We'll just wait and talk about it then, but know that it's part of the Columbian Exchange. That part of the Columbian Exchange is that people were stolen, enslaved from Africa and brought to North and South America and the Caribbean, where they worked in terrible conditions because they were forced to, with violence. All right, and on that note, now it's time for you to answer the AIM question. How did the Columbian Exchange change societies on both sides of the Atlantic? It's got to be at least 3 sentences. If it's not 3 sentences, I'm not going to grade it. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you next time.